Fire King Snake Eye Azamina is the best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! So today I'm going to teach you how to beat it. What's up Ocean, you got Matt here and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Video. Today we're talking about Fire King post Rage of the Abyss, where in my opinion it is the best deck of the format. The card does allow it to create one of the most diverse end boards in the entire game that's full of disruption and able to create a ton of follow-up as well, and the Azamina cards make the deck just that much better. So if you're looking to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And you don't know how to beat Fire King Snake Eye Azamina, then you're going to want to stick around, because in this video I'm going to show you the best cards to use against Fire King, when to use those cards, the choke points and weaknesses of the decks, and even what decks are best suited to beat it. So if you're excited for the video, then do me a favor and smash the like button, and of course subscribe to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. But with that being said, here's the ultimate guide on how to beat Fire King Snake Eye Azamina. Let's jump into it. So first things first, Fire King Snake Eye Azamina is a combination of 3 different engines that come together and create a really powerful deck. Those 3 engines are of course Fire King, which came out in the structure decks, we have Snake Eye, which came out in Phantom Nightmare, I believe was when it actually became the best of the best, and then we also have Azamina, which came out in Rage of the Abyss just a couple of weeks ago. The deck overall has one specific game plan in mind. That's to try and get all 3 of its engines into rotation. By getting all 3 engines available, you're able to set up a massive end board that's full of layered disruption that gives you follow-up as well, while also being able to give you negation too, which is very hard for your opponent to play through. To be more specific, you're really trying to establish Fire King Island on the field to get you consistent follow-up and set up your combo. You really want to get Sacred Garunix in the graveyard or in the hand to be able to consistently get you more interruption and additional bodies. You also want to get Promethean Princess in the graveyard because it's a great disruption piece as well. You want to try and establish a copy of Flamber's Dragon as well so you can get constant recovery and get extra bodies on field. And of course, if possible, you want to try and establish Ilya Sylvia as well because they great negate. It's not always going to happen in every single combo, but it definitely is a possibility, so try and make it happen. Now there are other end board pieces, but I'm going to cover that a little bit later. These ones are the ones you really try to establish as much as possible. The standard Fire King lists have about 16 or so one-card combos that are able to get you from one engine into the other while creating a very scary end board. Those cards are going to be pretty obviously 3 copies of Diabellstar the Black Witch with your 3 Wanted, 3 Bonfire as well as pretty standard because you have your 1 copy of Snake Eye Ash and Snake Eye Poplar, which both act as one-card combos. You of course have Fire King Island, which can technically get you there, as well as Fire King Sanctuary to pair that with Fire King Ponix and of course Ulcanix, the new Ulcanix as well. Now you definitely want to have multiple different starters in your opening hand, because having a copy of Ponix with a copy of Wanted for example allows you to play through so many forms of interruption and lets you set up a really crazy end board even through multiple hand traps. But in my opinion, the best starters for this strategy are easily going to be Bonfire or Snake Eye Ash, because they get you into the rest of your combo pieces a lot more easily. But here's what you can expect to see from a Fire King deck list. Starting off, of course, you have your Fire King cards that are part of the engine. There's some debate on if the correct ratio is 2 or 3 copies of Ulcanix and Kieran, but I think playing 3 of each is better. Also, Fire King Skyburn is optional, but it's seeing a lot of popularity. Then you add in your Snake Eye monsters and your Bonfires, followed by your Diabellstar package with the Sinful Spoils cards along with the new Azamina cards. Just remember that the ratio for how many Deception are played is up to the player. I think 1 is optimal, but I've seen people run it at 2 and even 3 copies. Then it's just Handtraps. Just know that every single Fire King Snake Eye list should have Ash Blossom because it protects them from the Molcharmies. But it's also a fire monster, so it can be used as an engine requirement in a pinch. Also, the deck can play Dominus Impulse, and it definitely should, because that card is crazy. As for the extra deck, what you're seeing now is the mandatory cards for the engines to function at their best, which leaves only 4 slots. Zombie Vampire and Kiki Nagashi Fucho is as close to mandatory as it gets in my opinion, while Salmon Great Raging Phoenix and World Sea Dragon Zealantis aren't mandatory but are highly recommended for the OTK. Now that you know what the deck looks like and what the deck kinda wants to do, what does the actual end board really look like for a standard Snake Eye Fire King combo? Well, most of the time you're going to be having your copies of both Sanctuary and Fire King Island on the field. This is going to be your follow-up and the extra interruption thanks to Sanctuary. Amphibious Swarmship Ambler Whale is usually one of the only monsters on the field, but sometimes it's paired with a Fire King Avatar Arvada for a monster negate and Azamina Ilya Sylvia for an Omni negate. In the graveyard, they have set up IP Masquerena, which can be summoned back when Ambler Whale is destroyed to enable access to SP Little Knights on the opponent's turn. Promethean Princess is there for more disruption, and Sacred Fire King Garunix, which will summon itself back if a fire monster is destroyed. In the hand, it's common for them to have Ponix, which has a mandatory effect to add itself from grave to hand if it's been destroyed. Fire King High Avatar Kirin is often in hand as well as a way to start destroying monsters and start triggering their effects, and even Ash Blossom, which can be added back from the graveyard to the hand by Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf, plus the extra card you draw off of Wanted's graveyard effect. And finally, Deception of the Sinful Spoils will be set face down as well. This board doesn't look super threatening, but it's consistently able to pressure the opponent and stop them from achieving their game plan. It can easily set up 8 or 9 interruptions if left unchecked, so don't be surprised if most of these are live when the turn passes back to you. But now that you know what the deck looks like, what the game plan is, and most of the common end board pieces, what are some ways we can actually stop the deck? Well, Handtraps are incredibly strong against this strategy, and these are the ones we're going to be covering today. Starting off, of course, with Ash Blossom. Ash is needed in pretty much every single deck because of the Mulcharmies, but against Fire King it's even more important. Almost any time you can effectively resolve Ash, it can turn off a portion of their engine. But here are your main options. If you want to Ash the Fire King engine, I would recommend using it on either Fire King Courtier Alkanix or on Fire King Island because you want to prevent them from getting to Garunix. For the Snake Eye engine, you can use it on OSS or on the effective Snake Eye Ash or Oak to summon from the deck. As for the Azamina engine, your only real option is to use it on Deception of the Sinful Spoils, which is extra relevant because they tribute a monster to search for a card. Now all these scenarios are great, but Ash Blossom being a fire monster really hurts, because as long as they can get 2 bodies on the field including a fire monster, they can summon out Hita, steal the Ash Blossom, link it to Promethean Princess, and just keep playing. But even with all that being said, I would absolutely recommend playing Ash Blossom against this deck. Droll is amazing against Fire King. The deck is constantly searching for new cards. Just the Fire King engine alone needs a few searches to reach its full potential. Whether they start with a copy of Ponix or Alkanix, it's adding a lot of cards from deck to hand. Snake Eyes also searches a lot, especially if they start off with Bonfire or Snake Eye Ash, and Droll slows them down significantly. And the same goes for Deception. Personally, I'm maining Droll and Lockbird right now because I think it's that strong of a card against this strategy. Next up is Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler, and both of these are terrific, but Imperm is definitely better. The biggest issue with these cards is Kirin, which can just get the targeted monster to dodge the negation, which is why I would recommend using Imperm on Diabellstar or a Link monster like Promethean Princess. The exception here is Snake Eye Ash. Negating Snash with Imperm or Veiler is so strong, and I feel the risk is well worth the reward. And just an FYI, if you have other Handtraps, you can definitely afford to negate any monster that's on summon, whether it's going to be Ponix or Alkanix, just keep that in mind. Moving on though to Nibiru. Nib is very strong against this deck too, but also is very dependent on the opponent's hand. Usually you can use Nib as they summon out the Promethean Princess and you can wipe away a big chunk of their board. But there are 3 problems with this. The first is Arvada. This is a monster negate that can technically be established before the 5th summon. It's less common, but it is possible. Azamina Ilya Sylvia is also a negate that they can get to early enough. Finally is Snake Eyes Flamber's Dragon, which when sent to the graveyard from hand or field will summon back 2 level 1 fires. This gives the opponent 3 bodies to try and remake their end board. On top of all of that, this doesn't take into account any extenders in the hand, like Kirin or Diabellstar. It's still a great choice, but usually best when paired with other Handtraps. I'd recommend using it either right after they summon Promethean Princess, or right before they get to the negate if possible. Fantastical Dragon Phantasme is technically able to draw a few cards using its effects, but usually they're not going to have any more than 2 Link monsters on the field. And be careful because it does play into Promethean Princess's graveyard effect. But Phantasme has just been completely power crept by Mulcharmy Fualos. Speaking of which, this card is amazing against the deck. Most of their plays involve summoning from the deck with OSS or the Snake Eye monsters, and even summoning multiple extra deck monsters too. It basically acts as a deterrent from playing the most optimal lines, and if they keep playing, they open themselves up to more Handtraps and engine to contend with. And keep in mind, you can always wait to use Fualos in response to a card that would trigger it. For example, chain it to the Hollowed Azamina to guarantee a draw. If you have it, I would definitely recommend it against Fire King. Just remember, it's really only useful if you're going second against them. As for Perulia, this card is arguably even better than Fualos. Unfortunately, you have to use it in the draw phase because your opponent can use Diabellstar as their first action, or just normal summon a monster, which would cost you a draw. That being said, it's still phenomenal. The deck is constantly adding cards from deck to hand, then summoning them, like Ponix or Garunix being added to hand, then summoned. Now Perulia likely won't be drawing the same amount of cards as Fualos, but it's still a big deterrent, and I definitely recommend it in the side deck for Fire King. As for Dimension Shifter, this card is insane against Fire King. It turns off almost all of their plays. For example, they can't special out Diabellstar, or use OSS or any Snake Eye monster to summon from the deck, or even the Fire King cards, because the Fire King monsters trigger when they're destroyed and sent to the graveyard. If they get banished, they won't trigger. And it's also so hard to get them back from the banishment. Shifter is the best hand trap against this deck, period. Bestials are solid, not really amazing though. The only really good targets for them in this deck are exactly IP and the Azamina monsters, and nothing else really matters. Honestly, I don't recommend Bestials for this matchup. DD Crow on the other hand is much better than Bestials, specifically because it can hit fire monsters like Ponix, Sacred Garunix, or even Promethean Princess. It's seeing a rise in popularity both because it's so good, but also because it's not a once per turn, and it's also a level 1 monster, so people can make Fucho with it. Ghost Bell is just okay. I don't really think it's worth playing. It's a temporary stop to a certain effect that can always be used on the next turn. I'd rather play DD Crow. But Ghost Ogre is really good here. There are a few solid targets for it, including Fire King Island, assuming they don't have Sanctuary already on the field, and if they do, you can always use it on the Sanctuary when they attempt to Quick Exceed summon. You can use it on the effective IP when they try to link summon on your turn, and it's great against Deception too, because they have to tribute a monster for cost, and you get rid of the card on field, so it's basically a 1 for 2 in that case. It's even solid to use against Promethean Princess to make it harder for them to access Ambler Whale. If you play a ton of hand traps, Ghost Ogre isn't a bad choice for Fire King decks at all. Finally is Dominus Impulse, which is crazy strong here because it's one of the only cards that can stop the summon effect from hand or graveyard of Sacred Garunix, or the summon from the extra deck of Hallowed Azamina. It's just tough that not every single deck can play it, but if you can, I definitely recommend it. My top 5 hand traps against Fire King Snake Eye Azamina are in no particular order: Dimension Shifter, Mulcharmy Perulia, Mulcharmy Fualos, Dominus Impulse, and Ash Blossom. But there are so many other ones that are really good too. Now hand traps are incredible against Fire King because they can do so much and you can use them on both your turn and on the opponent's. But not every deck can afford to play a ton of different hand traps. What if you want to play board breakers instead? Well, these are the ones we're going to be talking about today. Starting off with Evenly Matched. Evenly is pretty strong if you can bait out the negate with Ilia Sylvia, because the only way they can play around it is by using Kieran in hand to pop the Ambler Whale to bring back the IP, then link it to SP Little Knights to dodge the Evenly. And if you make them do all that, you can just say, okay, let's continue main phase, and you've successfully baited out a large portion of their interruptions. And if it can resolve, that's really good because they can lose a ton of resources. It's a great card, but it's not a game ender by any means. Dark Ruler No More is not very good. Most of their interruptions can be summoned back from the graveyard or the hand and they can just rebuild their board very well. I think it's a terrible card against Fire King. But what about tributing cards like Kaijus, Lava Golem, and Sphere Mode? I don't really like any of them. Gamma Seal is nice to get rid of Ambler Whale without triggering its effect to revive anything, but it's not good enough. Lava Golem gives them a fire monster to pop with Promethean Princess, so it's definitely not a consideration. And Sphere Mode isn't always live against the deck. Also, you use up your normal summon for both Lava Golem and Sphere Mode. Change of Heart is technically solid and can get rid of cards like Ambler Whale, but it's not strong enough into established boards, especially because Kieran is able to dodge targeted effects. But I really love Triple Tactic Talents. I think it's very strong. You can rip a Kieran out of the hand or take control of a card without targeting and link it away. The deck can also play a ton of hand traps, and Kieran can only be used in the main phase, so it's very likely that Talents will be online. Also, Triple Tactic Thrust is incredible against this deck, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Fenrir is fine. It forces out Promethean Princess early, but if it can resolve, then that's obviously even better. Banishing cards face down makes it almost impossible for them to be recovered. It's just not that common to see today. As for Raigeki, Dark Hole, Lightning Storm, and Harpy's Feather Duster, all of these board wipes are really bad. In my opinion, they all really suck because Fire King Sanctuary can protect Fire King Island, and they want their monsters to be destroyed to trigger their effects. The only exception is that if you can use 2 Dark Holes back to back, then it gets a bit better. Either way, I'd recommend using other cards instead. And Cosmic Cyclone is amazing, going first and going second. Using Cosmic Cyclone on Fire King Island is super strong because it blows up their whole board. It's just a terrific choice. Now there are definitely some other cards that I've missed talking about in this section, so I want to go over a few other options that are really solid, going first and going second. Starting off with cards that are great going first. The first one I want to talk about is easily going to be Deck Lockdown. This Floodgate is ridiculously strong against Fire King for a few reasons. Number 1, it shuts off a lot of what the Fire King strategy tries to do, which is add from deck to hand then special summon, and it stops what the Snake Eye cards wants to do by summoning directly from the deck. So just having access to Deck Lockdown turns off a significant portion of this engine. The only tricky thing is if your opponent has a way to trigger the effect of Kieran to summon a monster and destroy a card, then they have a way to out the copy of deck lockdown, but it's not always going to be the case. Different Dimension Ground is also a great card against this matchup because they all want their cards to go to the graveyard. If you can chain the effect of Different Dimension Grounds to a copy of Fire King Alkanix, for example, or Sacred Fire King Garunix, you're going to be in a really good position because you can get rid of a ton of their resources. And it's even better because you can set this card off of Triple Tactic Thrust directly from the deck. Now that's really important because a lot of the effects in Fire King are mandatory, specifically Ponix and the OG Garunix. But let's talk about Triple Tactic Thrust a little bit more, because it's so good because you can also search for cards when you're going second. Cards like Soul Release, which is an incredible option when going second. The card is super simple. Target up to 5 cards in either graveyard and banish them. That is insane because you can just go Thrust because your opponent has a mandatory effect of Ponix to add back to hand in the standby phase. You search for Soul Release, you then activate Soul Release, and at that point, you can get rid of the IP in the graveyard. You can get rid of the copy of Sacred Garunix in the graveyard, the Promethean Princess, Flamber's Dragon, and anything else that you really want to. Soul Release is a great way to ensure you have a good chance of just winning the game on the spot. If you're already playing Thrust, you should definitely be playing Soul Release. You could also play Forbidden Droplet as a really solid choice to negate cards at quick effect speed. The issue is not every deck can afford to play it because it can be kind of expensive to maintain the cost of the card, but it still is a great choice nonetheless to negate cards like the effect of IP Masquerena, the Arvada, the Ilya Sylvia, and so on. Now let's talk about some choke points and weaknesses of the deck, starting off with Sacred Fire King Garunix. This card is like the heart and soul of the strategy. Being able to constantly bring itself back, pop cards from the hand, the field, the deck to be able to gain advantage is really good. If you can stop this card from being accessed at all through Fire King Island or through Alkanix, it's going to get you a really good chance of winning a game. I also believe that Snake Eye Flamber's Dragon is also a really big choke point for the strategy. If you can stop them from bringing back the 2 additional level 1 bodies, they have a hard time extending to what they want to do. And if you're playing a deck like Tenpai Dragon and they decide to bring back 2 level 1s, they can overlay into Kiki Nagashi Fucho, which is going to stop your OTK. That being said, you do have plays around that, but I definitely recommend not letting Flamber's Dragon resolve if you can, so negating it with a copy of Impulse can be really strong. And then the biggest weakness of this strategy, in my opinion, is its over-reliance on the graveyard. It really needs the graveyard to play. Shifter just completely shuts this deck down entirely, so if you can stop their access to the graveyard with Different Dimension Ground or Dimension Shifter or whatever, you're going to be in a really good spot. Now let's talk about some decks that have a good matchup, an average matchup, and a bad matchup against Fire King Snake Eye Azamina. A deck with a good matchup, in my opinion, is going to be Tenpai Dragon. Not only is Tenpai able to main deck Dimension Shifter, Moltrami Fubolos, and Moltrami Perulia, it's able to OTK out of nowhere. And because it can main all 3 of those cards, it can take some hands that would normally be full combo for Fire King and make them just unplayable. And yes, Fire King can technically get to Fucho as a way to prevent the OTK. That's fine, because a lot of the time, Tenpai players are now making a copy of Ruddy Rose Dragon, which on summon will banish the graveyards for both players. That means that Fire King players won't have access to any of their resources, and they might just lose the game on the spot. As for a deck with an average matchup, I would say a deck like Centurion is pretty solid. The deck is able to play a ton of hand traps to stop the Fire King player from doing anything. They can also be pretty resilient to destruction effects, which is the majority of the ways that Fire King can interrupt the opponent. And on top of that, the deck can get access to Cosmic Blazar Dragon, which can shut down the majority of the plays that Fire King players want to make. But the reason I say it's an average matchup is because the deck can still get to Flamber's Dragon pretty easily, which can then take a copy of Primera or Trudea or any monster really, and place it in the spell and trap zone as a continuous spell card, which means they can't activate their effect because it's not a continuous trap card. Oh, and of course, Fire King can still play an incredibly grindy game if it comes to it. Now, as for a deck with a bad matchup, for the first time ever, I'm going to say I don't actually believe any deck necessarily has like a bad matchup against Fire King. Fire King is able to consistently be able to just constantly recycle their resources, outgrind you, just constantly bring back big bodies that it's hard to contend with. And they can play a ton of hand traps too. So I don't think it's any deck that's really necessarily that bad against it. If I had to pick one, I would say that Runic Stun kind of has a difficult time at times because there's so many ways that they can just get rid of Runic Fountain. On top of that, they also have ways to activate all their effects in hand or on field to play around different floodgates that the deck plays. Overall, Fire King Snake Eye Azamina is the best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh right now. It can play through a ton of interruptions, set up multiple ways to disrupt their opponents, maintain its ability to follow up and just do multiple different plays on the following turns, and it can OTK out of nowhere. The deck is insane and definitely to me is the best deck in the room, but at least now you know how to beat it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, do me a favor and smash the like button, I would really appreciate it. Comment your thoughts on the deck down below and what deck you want to see me cover next in my how to beat guide. I will be bringing deck profiles and guides on how to beat Rizal and Malice, which are coming out in December, so make sure to stick around for that. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.